You are listening to Music is My Life, a podcast from Berklee Online. I'm your host, Pat Healy, and listeners, I want you to take note of Sam Amidon. He has a new album out now on the Nonesuch label. It's called The Following Mountain, and it merges his folk roots with jazzier explorations and adventurous collaborations. When he was touring with Wilco drummer Kotche last year, Sam paid a visit to our Boston headquarters to talk about his musical upbringing, his open approach to working with others, and why he will sometimes marry the lyrics of R. Kelly with a melody that is hundreds of years old.
I grew up playing a lot of traditional music, and I grew up in New England, in Vermont, and I played the fiddle. That was my sole instrument, for growing up. And in New England, there's a fiddle style, traditional fiddle style, but that style, I realized when I was young, is really just a combination of Irish tunes, French Canadian tunes, and Appalachian American tunes. So I really gravitated towards the Irish tunes. So that was my whole thing as a kid, was like playing fiddle tunes. And my whole experience of folk music was very specific. It was like tunes. And as a listener, as a teenager, I was into all kinds of other stuff. I got into Jimi Hendrix and then Yo La Tengo and indie rock bands that was late 90s, and free jazz, Albert Ayler, Miles Davis, jazz, all this stuff that I was listening to. And then I came to New York and started playing in different kinds of bands, and then this project came about of singing folk songs again, but in a different way. And I don't think of this as folk music, what I do. And the source material is just completely accidental, whatever is in my head, But I listen to a lot of field recordings. I love this music, and I listen to a lot of, when I moved to England, I started listening to some of that psych folk stuff, Bert Jansch, and, that kind of Martin Carthy and all that stuff as well. So it's just wherever you go and you keep your little whatever those are, up.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about what the first music was that made you keep your antennas up, as it were.
My parents are musicians, and I grew up watching them be musicians and making a living as musicians. And that was very instructive because the way they made that work, because they had kids, they conceived of being a musician in a very open way, right? It was not limited to just being a performer in front of an audience, especially because they didn't want to tour heavily, and have that kind of... and so they had an array of things they were interested in, and they just pursued those things. And then they found creative ways over time for those things to combine, and they loved traditional folk music. They loved teaching and working with children. They love storytelling. They love folk dance. And so they eventually just do all of that, and they teach teachers and they give workshops. But then their interest changed over time. My dad has become interested in choral arranging. So now he's doing that. But instead of just trying to go into the choral world, he's staying kind of in the world they're in, the folk music world in general, and, but doing arrangements of things. So, they just had a very pragmatic way where it was they pursued their interests, but they also paid attention to what was coming back, from the world, what the world was asking them to do as well as what they were. So that's been inspiring for me as well. I have not been strategic at all in my life about how to make a living as a musician. I have had different skills, some of which are related, some of which are totally unrelated. And, different skills there's a demand for different ones at different time, and when my initial skill was Irish fiddle tunes. So when I first came to New York, I was just telling you before the interview started, I had a job as a typist, transcribing interviews, part-time job. And then in the evenings I would play Irish sessions around New York, and that was a wonderful thing. And play the fiddle. And then eventually, as this started to happen, I was doing it, and that took over, So it's not like I was I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to be this kind of musician and I'm going to do these gigs and that's what's going to happen. It was I had different interests, and then there were different things that people responded to in what I was doing. And I did make some choices, some, for example, the folk music gigs I was doing booked way in advance at a certain point. And at a certain point I knew that I wanted to be able to do different kinds of music. And so I actually quit taking those. This might be a more interesting viewpoint. So one thing about me is that I started performing with my parents when I was a kid. And then even as a teenager, I had a band with my friend Thomas Bartlett and my brother Stefan and a musician named Keith Murphy. And we were called Popcorn Behavior, and we played in the folk circuit. And I was booking gigs when I was 15 for us, And so by the time I got to college, I was making a living as a professional musician, and so I started off from that point. But one of the most liberating moments for me was, ironically, that around the age of 24, I quit being a professional musician. I stopped taking the folk gigs because they booked way in advance and they were preventing me from being able to shift and try new things out. And I took a day job in New York, and all of a sudden, for the first time since I was ever really, I was able to say yes to a gig no matter whether it paid money or not, And I made friends and got, played whatever random gig in Brooklyn for $20 or $0, And it was so freeing for that year to all of a sudden just play music, And eventually it started to come back, and I started to get gigs and do different kinds of things. And so there's one thing for me, as I think, trying to, on the one hand, I love music profoundly and I play it all the time, but I'm not too worried about, you have to make a living and you have to play music if you love music. And however those two combine at different times in your life, is cool.
Your approach seems refreshingly easygoing. I constantly hear talk of people in the industry saying they have to, get a song synced in a movie just to make ends meet.
I mean, for me, the way I've made it work, I haven't really gotten any big syncs or yet, or that kind of stuff. So it's been much more really through performing and merch, and all that old-fashioned stuff and touring. And the way that I've, I just keep costs really low. I stay with friends, and I'm used to like just a certain way of traveling and that I'm comfortable with and that I really enjoy. And just being creative about things, and allowing the circumstances to dictate what you do to a point. Like I never, for example, I used to do South by Southwest, but I never paid thousands of dollars to do South by Southwest. I would do it if I could go there on my own. Maybe I had some friends who were playing and I could get one of them to join me on my set. Just being creative, sinking time. I never went into debt, to do my thing in that way. In a way that was healthy because of that feedback thing. It causes you to pay attention to what's coming back. And of course, I did push I did push and I worked hard and I did a lot of stuff where I wasn't, I was putting a lot in and but it wasn't just sinking tons of, because you feel like that's what you're supposed to do, And if I could go play somewhere solo, I'd play solo. And there were times when it was important to have a band and do that stuff too. But I kind of just have let those arise in different ways, and really do it much more through collaboration with other musicians and allow that to open up possibilities. And
so you're playing with Glenn tonight, and he will join you on a few of your songs. And again, it's something you don't often see artists engaging in collaboration and not necessarily the most rehearsed circumstances. Why is collaboration so important for you?
Collaboration is huge, and it's the whole point of music, and these more creative ways where, double bills where we play together is so fun. And for me, growing up, again, coming out of the traditional folk music world, the whole tradition of an Irish session or any kind of genre session where you step into a pub and you have a shared repertoire with people you've never met and you can play music with them for 4 hours, And so I've tried to almost create that in my own music. And even though my music isn't folk music in that sense, it's my own weird stuff that I make to play with people. And another thing also that was inspired me from the traditional music scene is the idea of playing with your heroes. They're not unapproachable in the way that they are in other genres. The greatest traditional Irish fiddlers play weekly at their pub in their town, and in old time music, it's the same way. You go to a jam session, everybody's going to come out and play. And so that kind of, like Bill Frisell, one of my total musical heroes since I was 16. And, it eventually happened, and it happened. I'm lucky that it happened. But at the same time, I think I didn't have an idea that he was some invisible, it came about slowly and organically, but it was something that came from just the idea of seeking out people that are inspiring, to you of any kind and just seeing what happens.
And so then how do you know when you've found a kindred spirit musically? What is it that you look for in a collaborator that you know you've clicked?
The thing that I found in terms of when I made my first record of songs is like, it does, and this is a total cliche, but it does come from like being yourself. You know, it's like there was a moment when I was kind of trying to be a different kind of musician because I thought that's what I had to be to play with people, you know, and I was trying to learn skills that weren't, and I'm glad I did that because it was a great musical enrichment to get into that stuff, but it wasn't really, you know, my calling in that way at that time. So I found that by just making my own thing in my way as much as possible, not my own in like a ego way, but just in like a natural, like what's inside you and what do you have to do, that leads to collaboration, you know, if you're coming out of your own place. And yeah, all of the collaborations have been fairly organic and sometimes just random, like people just put you together and try and see what happens. But you know, they often come out of friendships, of course, and just curiosity but I'm fairly, you know, I have a fairly small group of people that I do work with a lot, you know, in terms of on my albums and stuff. And that because part of that is because I don't do that much arrangement myself beforehand. You know, I'm much more like in the moment arranger with musicians. So on my records, I've always hired people that I just have absolute trust in and who I know will not listen to me that carefully. Because it's more interesting and you know, and just see what happens in those moments.
Now, not everything that you do is collaborative, of course. So how do you make the distinction when you have a particular song you're working on that you say, well, this is just me solo, or I think I need more people on this? I
started off with this project of singing songs and reworking folk songs, and it was a very private thing initially because I didn't do it on purpose as a thing like I'm going to do a gig. I was just wanted to learn how to play the guitar. It was about 12 years ago, and as part of learning how to play the guitar, you know, I started singing. I'd learn a Bob Dylan song or a Beatles song or something, you know, and to trying to learn chords. And then just in my house, I was lonely. I moved to New York. I didn't know anybody. And I spent a lot of time in my apartment. And you know, and so it came out of that. Like I started writing some music and singing the folk songs. So it started as a very private and solo thing. And but then my roommate was a musician, Thomas Bartlett, and so he started adding stuff. And we were too shy to play it at the same time because it was we'd played music together since we were kids, but it was such a new thing for us. I was very shy because I had mostly played fiddle up to that point. And so from that moment it became collaborative, you know, and the way that my thing kind of developed was people just hearing the solo thing and then wanting to add stuff, you know, and it became a platform for collaboration with Thomas, Nico Muley, Shahzad Ismaily, and other musicians. And the parts that I write are very clear, but they're very open. You know, they're not like a lot of different chords, but they do have certain little patterns that are hiccups and things for people and I think that works for other musicians too, because there's a lot of room for other stuff to happen, but it's very concrete at the same time. At this point, my main decision about who to play with is just, you know, the budget, who's hired, who's in town, you know, it's very accidental. But I really enjoy that. Like, I'm not sure I'm somebody who could do the 6-week tour with the same people and the same set list. You know, when I do a tour out of necessity, it tends to be like one night with, you know, this duo with Glenn. Wednesday I had a solo show. Next week I have a gig with Nico. You know, it's quite varied, and it's enjoyable.
So I think about your version of Walking on Sunshine by Katrina and the Waves, and how you basically take this peppy 1980s song and make it sound like a folk classic that's been passed down through generations. How do you figure out how you're going to put your own spin on something?
Well, when I'm coming up with my material, which on these last 5 records has been, I'm not like a songwriter, you know, all the words, at least, if not the words and the melodies, come from mostly traditional folk songs from different places, but sometimes also R. Kelly or, you know, Mariah Carey or whatever. And in terms of making it in my own, I don't worry about that consciously that much. You know, if I hear a song and I just sing it and it feels good in the way that I learned it, sometimes I'll just sing it that way. You know, I do a song called Walkin' Boss, and in terms of what I'm doing, it's pretty much identical to Jeff Davis, who I learned it from. The band does something else. But in most of the cases, the music is very, very different in my case. And the way that is that often I write the other parts before the song comes. The song often comes last. So I'll compose a little guitar riff. So that's something I've just made from scratch. And then I'll cast about for a song to sing on the top. And then once I choose that song, that might shift the arrangement a bit. But it often, in most cases for my music, it starts with my own, something I've written. So it's starting as my thing, and then I'm folding other things into it.
You mentioned coming up with a riff as kind of the beginning of a song. And I guess it would be great, since you've got your guitar here, why don't you walk us through that process? If
I'm working on a song, it just starts through truly just messing around on the guitar in a deeply absent-minded way, or the banjo. And one thing that can be fun, this is a specific little exercise, and this is not true for that many of my tunes, but is like, putting the guitar into a different tuning and messing around in that tuning, and then trying to change it back to standard tuning and relearn it there and see if you can, that can kind of open you up to different ideas. And so yeah, it just has to do with a shape. Like you might notice a shape in a song that you learn from somewhere else. I did this one, I was just messing around with like, these kind of shapes, voice leading, which often comes from a lot of the open D things, like Joni Mitchell, let me think for a second. 1 second. Let me think about how to talk about this. Yeah, like Joni Mitchell, for example, has like, things where she's in the open D tuning, and it's that a lot of those harmonies. And that's a harmony that happens really naturally when you're in open D. So I put the guitar back into standard, and I still tried to get those harmonies going. And then I made it minor. So then eventually I came up with this little lick. I tried singing over it, and it came out sort of da da da. That's all I had, I think. And it came from just messing around with those kind of shapes and then picking. And then I didn't have any words. I didn't have any folk song melody that came in that case, but the words came from my mind, there's a song called Short Life of Trouble, which goes, a short life of trouble, few more days of woe. It's a whole song. So I just took the words only, because this melody and the words, and because this song this thing that had come up was very mournful, da, 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 da. So it was very minor and mournful. And so then I just tried getting the words in as best I could, and it required adding some more stuff. A short life of trouble, few more days of woe. A short life of trouble, a few more days. There you go. So that's one where I wrote that's all my own music, but it came from just like checking out somebody's guitar, messing around with those guitar shapes. And then in that case, I had started in open tuning and put it into standard. Now, is that a huge pain when you're registering copyright? Well, in my case, it's like a co-write with Anonymous. Right. And, but it's, there's a varying degrees, because in some cases in that case, I've written the music 100% myself, and the words I've like snatched from, so there's some songs where I've effectively written it from scratch, because even the words I've just taken little bits here and there and maybe added my own phrase. There's one where but in other ones, there is more of a connection to the earlier version. The melody that I'm singing might be the exact same, and the harmonization is different. And so, yeah, I register it, but it's it's basically a co-write with traditional.
Sam Amidon doing co-writes with traditional. And on his latest album, he does stray from that approach, and he collaborates with the likes of Milford Graves, Sam Gendel, and longtime collaborator Shahzad Ismaily to form something new. That's The Following Mountain, and it's out on Nonesuch now. If you would like to see video of Sam Amidon playing Short Life in our studio, visit the Berklee Online YouTube channel. And if you want to check out some more great content, visit us at online.berklee.edu/take note. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you soon.